Shri Radha Vinod Bihari Ju ki jai. Shri Govinda Gopinath Maran Mohan Ju ki jai. Nitya Lila Pravishtam Vishnupa Rashata Rashata Shishimar Bhakti Vedanta Narayan Gosai Maharaj Shila Gurudev ki jai. Nitya Lila Pravishtam Vishnupar Ashtata Rashata Shishimar Bhakti Vedanta Vaman Gosai Maharaj ki jai. Nitya Lila Pravishtam Vishnupar Rashata Rashata Shishimar Bhakti Vedanta Swami Maharaj Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Nityal Pravishtam Vishnupad Ashutara Shata Shishimar Bhakti Pragyan Keshav Goswami Maharaj ki jai. Nityalila Pravishtam Vishnupad Ashutara Shata Shishimar Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami Prabhupada ki jai. Nityalila Pravishta Maha Bhagavat Shilagor Kishoras Babaji Maharaj ki jai. Nityalila Pravishta Shila Sachid Ananda Bhakti Vinod Thakur ki jai. Nityalila Pravishta Vaishnav Sarvabhauma Shila Jagannath Das Babaji Maharaj ki jai. Shri Rupanu Gauriya Guru Varga ki jai. Shila Baladev Vijibhushan Prabhu ki jai. Shila Vishwanath Chakrabarti Thakur ki jai. Shri Nartam Srinivas Shamananda Prabhu Trai ki jai. Shila Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami Par ki jai. Shri Rupa Sanatan Bhatta Raghunath, Shri Jeev Gopal Bhatta Dashagunath, Shard Goswami Prabhu ki jai. Shri Sarup Damodar Rai Ramanandari, Shri Gaur Parshad Vrinda ki jai. Nam Achay Shila Haridas Thakur ki jai. Prem se kaho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda, Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Gaur Bhakta Vrinda ki jai. Shiksheta Mandal, Gora Mandal, Vraja Mandal, Mathura Vrindavan Dham ki jai. Sarva Abhishta Pradati Giriraj Maharaj ki jai. Shri Radha Kund Shama Kund ki jai. Shri Amuna Devi Ganga Devi ki jai. Shri Tulsi Maharani Vrinda Devi ki jai. Shri Bhakti Devi ki jai. Shri Purnamasi Yoga Maya ki jai. Shri Gopeshwar Mahadev ki jai. Shri Harinam Sankirtan ki jai. Ananta Koti Vaishna Vrinda ki jai. Samagata Gaur Bhakta Vrinda ki jai. Shri Nitai Gaur Premanande Hari Hari Bo. Srila Jiva Goswami Pad ki jai. Srila Satchidananda Bhakti Vinod Thakur ki jai. Dandavat Pranams Yashoda Didi and Raseshwari Mataji. Hari Bo. All right, so yeah, we already went through the first two articles by Vrindaranya Dasi on this topic of she's showing how Srila Jiva Goswami, yes, he gave many examples showing how we'll find many places where he's explaining how bhakti is bestowed, but he also gives many examples of how it's simultaneously inherent. And so this is so we're continuing going through these articles where Vrindaranya Devi is showing this. She's giving many yeah, so let's go through this. This is the third article, the simultaneous inherency and bestowal of bhakti, part 3. And here she'll go give the example of the swan. This is available on harmonist.us. All right, let me put it in reader view. Before I establish simultaneous inherency and bestowal based on the Sandarbhas and other foundational Gaudiya literature, which will quickly become philosophically terse, I want to do a couple of things that will be useful in understanding the articles that follow. 1. Illustrate simultaneous inherency and bestowal in an accessible way by providing an analogy. Although this analogy won't satisfy those who want all the points to be established with philosophical references, it gives a framework that will hopefully make the later arguments somewhat easier to follow. So first she's giving this analogy. Then second, explain some topics related to simultaneous inherency and bestowal. And 3, explain the difference between the Atma and the Jiva. So these are the 3 points that she'll be going through in this article. Simultaneous, inherency, and bestowal. To illustrate simultaneous inherency and bestowal of bhakti, I would like to relate an analogy that Sundar Gopal gave in his presentation mentioned in my first article. This analogy makes clear what might otherwise seem like an opaque concept. A swan in its natural state swims happily in a lake. Its nature, its dharma of being a swimmer, is inherent. However, when a swan is kept in a cage and not allowed to fulfill its nature, it becomes unhappy and exhibits the perverted nature of plucking its own feathers. Despite experiencing such suffering, a swan that has been held captive for a long time will not walk out of the cage even if you open it. Being conditioned by its long imprisonment, the swan needs help to get out. That help is bestowal of mercy. When the swan is lifted out and put on a lake, only then will it exhibit its true nature and thereby experience happiness. So a swan, even if it has never been in sorry, so a swan, even if it never has been in the water because of being caged, is meant to swim. One could say that God created the swan with swimming in mind. Nonetheless, because it is caged, its nature does not manifest. So we can ask, is it the swan's nature to swim even though it is caged, plucking its own feathers and not touching water? Yes, that is so, even though the swan won't swim unless someone lifts it out of the cage and places it in the water. This analogy shows both inherent nature, swimming, and bestowal of mercy, lifting the swan onto the lake. Both are necessary for the caged swan. But we may ask further, which is more real, the inherent nature or the bestowal of grace? They are both real. Can we say that the swan is a swimmer if it doesn't exhibit that nature without grace? Of course we can. If you have any questions or any points you'd like to mention throughout this, yeah, please feel free to leave comments and I'll be checking the comments. For a characteristic to be inherent, it must be an intrinsic part of something's very nature. The thing or person is incomplete and fails to manifest its nature if the characteristic does not manifest. For example, a person has the potential to be a millionaire. However, being a millionaire is not an intrinsic part of being a person. Since being a millionaire is not an intrinsic aspect of what it means to be a person does not fulfill its nature by being a millionaire. And a poor person can be fulfilled. Yeah, a poor person can be fulfilled. Because, yeah, that makes sense. A person who is poor is no less a person than someone who is rich. In the case of a mango tree, can we say that its nature of producing mangoes is solely due to the person who watered it? Or are the mangoes due to something inherent in the seed? Or are both things necessary? Yes, both are necessary, thus showing simultaneous inherency and bestowal. That's the problem. Why people say, oh, the soul has potential for bhakti, but it's a lot more than just having potential for bhakti. It's bhakti is inherent. If we just say potential for bhakti like this, she says, for example, a person has a potential to be a millionaire, but that doesn't mean that being a millionaire is an intrinsic part of being a person. No. So yeah, it's a really good example. A soul with any of the 5 relationships with God is manifesting its nature. For example, one who is in Vatsalya Bhav feels completely, that person who is in Vatsalya Bhav feels completely fulfilled in the relationship. he or she does not feel less fulfilled than someone in Madhurya Bhav. In contrast, the jiva takes on a false nature when covered by Maya, and thereby fails to manifest its true nature. And one second, just seeing what the messages are coming. Okay, it's something separate. Okay, for example, one who is in sorry, I just read this. Okay, let me just reread that. For example, one who is in Vatsalya Bhav feels completely fulfilled in the relationship. He or she does not feel less fulfilled than someone in Madhurya Bhav. In contrast, the jiva takes on a false nature when covered by Maya, and thereby fails to manifest its true nature. An individual soul only displays all aspects of his true nature when he is established as a servant of God. Herein, we see one shortcoming of saying that bhakti is not inherent, but is merely a potential. While being a millionaire is not an intrinsic part of being a person, being a servant of God is an intrinsic part of being an Atma. Thus, to say that being a servant is merely a potential of the Atma is to ignore the fact that without being a servant of God, the Atma displays a false nature. Therefore, we need to acknowledge both inherency and bestowal to capture the true nature of the soul's relationship with bhakti. The inherency part of the equation underscores the fact that the purpose of our existence is to serve God. Without this, we are incomplete and unfulfilled. This is a very essential point to clearly to grasp. This is our whole philosophy is based on this. our inheritance. Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami recounts an excellent parable. What's a parable? A parable is a simple story used to illustrate a moral or spiritual lesson. Okay. Am I saying that right? Parable, right? Yeah. Okay. So Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami recounts an excellent parable that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu told Sanatan Goswami that explains simultaneous inherency and bestowal. Before telling the parable, Mahaprabhu speaks several verses, including this one. Krishna bhuli she jiva anadir bahirmukh Ataeva maya tare deya sangsara dukh. Having forgotten, the living entity has been attracted by the external feature from time immemorial. Therefore, the illusory energy, Maya, gives him all kinds of misery in his material existence. Although the verse says that the jiva has been attracted to the external energy from time without beginning, from anadi, anadi means no beginning. So, from beginningless time, the jiva has been attracted by the external energy. Even though it says that, it is significant that Mahaprabhu uses the word bhuli, having forgotten, which effectively conveys the idea that the relationship already exists. What would there be to forget if there wasn't already some relationship? The parable goes as follows. A learned astrologer goes to the house of a poor and distressed man and tells him that the man's father, who is very wealthy, died elsewhere and was not able to reveal that he had left a great treasure as an inheritance. Similarly, the Vedic literature tells us that we have a great treasure in the form of a relationship with Krishna, which is our inheritance. The astrologer advised the man exactly how to remove the dirt to reveal the inheritance. There is likewise a proper way to excavate our treasure. We should give up karma, gyan, and yoga, and instead take to bhakti, by which Krishna can be fully satisfied. As the similarity of terms suggests, inherited implies a dimension of inherence. If I am searching for my inheritance, it is because I own it inherently, by virtue of my rational identity as an inheritor. By the grace of a sadhu, or the astrologer in the parable, I can locate that inheritance and manifest my inherent identity as an inheritor. Thus, the story clearly shows both bestowal, since the man would not have known about the inheritance without the mercy of the astrologer, and inherency, since the man already possessed a treasure that he did not know about. After the parable, Mahaprabhu says, in all revealed scriptures, beginning with the Vedas, the central point of attraction is Krishna. When complete knowledge of him is realized, the bondage of Maya, the illusory energy, is automatically broken. By knowing Krishna, one knows oneself. Related topics. Let me just check the comments. Haribo Bhavatarani Mataji. Okay. The fact that bhakti is bestowed is clearly established throughout the Sandarbhas. In the coming articles, I will thus not endeavor to establish this self evident point. Yeah, we already know that bhakti is bestowed. However, one must not think that because I'm establishing inherency, I'm negating bestowal. But how can this be? Why would bhakti need to be bestowed if it is inherent? Although I will answer this scripturally later, let me begin by answering in more simple terms. Those who say that bhakti is inherent would say that our inherent nature is lost to us. Think of the swan trapped in a cage. And we are consequently suffering and cannot get out of our predicament without help. As Paramatma Sandarbha, quoting Srimad Bhagavatam 11:22-10 says, self-realization for the jiva who is saddled with beginningless ignorance is not possible by his own efforts. It is possible only if knowledge is imparted to him by another who knows the reality. What saddled mean? A seat fashioned on the back of a horse. Okay, burdened. One with an onerous responsibility or task. He is saddled with debts of $12 million. Okay, sorry, I didn't know that word. So, as Paramatma Sandarbha quoting Srimad Bhagavatam says, self-realization for the jiva who is saddled with beginningless ignorance is not possible by his own efforts. It is possible only if knowledge is imparted to him by another who knows the reality. We're dependent on mercy. Therefore, although it is our nature to be a servant of God, this nature is unmanifest in our present condition. Because of the extent of our material conditioning, there is no practical difference in terms of sadhan between those who accept inherency and those who do not. Therefore, all the verses that establish the need for accepting a guru, bhakti as abhidheya, and so forth are accepted by both sides of the issue. The difference between the jiva and the atma. An important point to keep in mind when sorting out this controversy is the difference between the atma and the jiva. In a general sense, the liberated soul is referred to as atma, and the bound soul as jiva. Therefore, when you hear a statement about the jiva, such as the jiva has no bliss, you have to remember that this statement is not discussing an eternal characteristic of the atma. Although the atma is inherently blissful, when he is covered, he doesn't realize his true nature. For example, in the previous analogy, the man who didn't realize that he had an inheritance thought that he was poor, although he was actually rich. Similarly, although one of the Sarup Lakshan, one of the intrinsic characteristics of the jiva is that he is Chid Anandatmaka, intrinsically of the nature of knowledge and bliss, one of his Tatashta Lakshan, one of the extrinsic or accidental attributes, is that he is identified with the material world and is thus ignorant and suffering. Because the soul has both intrinsic and extrinsic characteristics, It would be a mistake to think that every statement about the jiva is describing an intrinsic characteristic. That said, there's a lot of overlapping of the terms. For example, the soul's 21 characteristics, being eternal, can be said to be the characteristics of both the jiva or the atma. Furthermore, as we will see in part 11, Jiva Goswami sometimes even refers to eternally liberated devotees as Tatastha Jivas. The Paramatma Sandarbha describes both the intrinsic and extrinsic characteristics of the soul. The extrinsic characteristics are not part of the soul's eternal characteristics. They are temporary and related to the fact that the soul is in bondage. The intrinsic characteristics are eternal. They stay with the soul whether it is in bondage or liberated. However, whether the characteristics are fully manifest or not depends on whether the soul is bound or liberated. For example, the soul's characteristic of chid anandatmaka, intrinsically of the nature of knowledge and bliss, is not manifest when the soul is covered by maya. This characteristic is only fully manifest when the soul is liberated from material nature, and one cannot be liberated without bhakti. Thus, as you can see, it can be somewhat difficult to properly understand the characteristics of the soul. It is very common in this controversy for someone to quote a statement that is describing a tatastha lakshan of the soul as if it were a sarup lakshan. As such, careful discernment is in order. In this article, we have touched on the paradox of simultaneous inherence and bestowal. In doing so, we have seen whether a characteristic is intrinsic or extrinsic, fully manifest or covered. We've seen so in doing so, we've seen that these 2 points, whether it is an intrinsic or extrinsic characteristic, are fully manifested or covered. This is something that must be considered. As such, having a solid understanding of the foundational principles covered in this article is immensely helpful. In the next article, we will look at what the previous Vaishnavacharyas have said in regard to bhakti being simultaneously inherent and bestowed. So I'm not going to read that now. We'll just go over this article for now. But let's see. Let me just click on this. We'll just get a preview of what we'll read next. The simultaneous inherency and bestowal of bhakti, part 4, Vaishnava Vedanta. So in this one, she'll go through Baladev Vijayabhushan's conclusion on this, and then of bhakti being inherent and bestowed, and Sri Ramanuja's conclusions, and Sri Nimbarkacharya's conclusions, Sri Madhvacharya's conclusions, and Sri Vallabhacharya's conclusions. And then she'll go back to Baladev Vijayabhushan and grace and conclusion. Yeah, so I'll read this next time. And she's publishing these articles, I think it was every Monday and Thursday. So I need to catch up. She'll be posting the 5th part, I guess, probably later this evening for us here in India, or for those in the West, sometime on Monday. So sometime tomorrow. All right. Thanks for joining me in this. Jai Shri Radhe. If anybody ever has any points or anything that they'd like to discuss on this, I'm always happy to discuss this topic. It's very important, especially now, to become strong in this Siddhanta and understand both sides of the argument and how actually everything is harmonized in our Acharya's writings. So, all right, Dandavat Pranam, everybody. Haribol. And actually, from this point on, the articles get a little bit more, actually not a little bit, a lot more, philosophically terse, as she put it. So this article is very helpful, just to, okay, we have something to go back to that's like relatable and understandable. It kind of brings it to earth a bit, because these points are so subtle. All right, Dandavat Pranams, Haribol.